Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala nabi al-kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'een. Rabbi shahri sadri wa yassirli amri wa hlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma la ilma lana illa ma 'allamta innaka alimul hakim. So alhamdulillah, we are now moving on to the next phase of this course, having completed a brief look at the golden ages of Islam and what were the cause of the rise and fall of the various golden ages. We are now going to tackle what is referred to as the Middle Ages, right? A point in time where the Muslims significantly lost power, but not to the level that they would later on. So, this ummah has gone through golden ages, middle ages, and dark ages. Golden ages, for example, like the time of the Abbasids, the Umayyads, the height of the Ottoman power. Dark ages like the Mongol invasion, which we will come to in a few weeks' time, and the current state of the Ummah. Between all of this, there were some middle ages as well. And the incidents we're going to look at over the next few weeks fall into that. And this is a time where the Ummah was still powerful, but it was also weak in some ways. And this is the era of the Crusaders. So, in the era of the Crusaders, while we still had the Abbasid Empire around, and while we still had control over many lands, there was some cracks starting to form in the Ummah. Cracks that, if they had not sealed them very quickly, could have caused an early downfall of this Ummah. So let's dive into it. What we're going to cover this week, and most likely next week as well, is we're going to take a look at who were the Crusaders, why did they come about, what did they do in the Muslim world. We focused on Muslim history, so we're not going to look at the Crusader history outside of the Muslim world. We're going to look primarily at the conquest of Al-Aqsa and the war between the Ayyubis and the Crusaders. They will come up again later in history when we discuss the rise of the Ottoman Empire, when we discuss we already discussed the Inquisition of Spain, that also was the Crusaders. But they kind of become like the standard villain in the Muslim story moving forward. So it's important that we understand their roots, their history, their origin, what they felt they were doing, what they thought they were doing, and what they ended up doing to the Muslim world, so that we can understand the next phase of our history. So, the first part of Muslim history, the Muslims were primarily at war with the Byzantine Empire, right? In this next phase, it's primarily the Crusaders. And then after that, the phase after that is the Mongols. And then comes colonialism. And that was the fall of the Ummah with World War One. So in every phase of our history, there's a different major villain at play, a major bad guy at play, trying to tear the Ummah apart and conquer the Muslim lands. And as we move away from the period of the Byzantiums being the primary enemy of the Muslims, as you'd have noticed over the past few lectures, that the Byzantiums are growing weaker. They are no longer a threat to the Muslims. And essentially, there was a lot of peace in the Muslim lands for hundreds of years, besides the civil wars, besides the actual fighting amongst the Muslims. So, at this point, a new enemy arises, the Crusaders from the West. So, who were the Crusaders? Let's take a look at who they were, what caused their rise, and what they did to the Muslim world. Who were the Crusaders? The Crusaders are described as a series of religious wars initiated, supported, and sometimes directed by the Latin Church in the medieval period. So, going back 1000 years to the year 1000 Christian era, it was at that point in time that the Pope came up with a new concept called the Crusades. And the Crusades were developed as a religious reason to go out and fight the Muslims. Why? Why didn't this happen before? Why did it happen at this specific point in time? Well, before this, if we look at the hundreds of years before this, the Muslims were fighting the Byzantiums. Right? Now, remember, the Byzantiums and the Western Europeans followed two very different understandings of Christianity, very different from each other. They essentially saw each other as disbelievers and as enemies. They did not support each other. And the Muslims had taken these lands from the Byzantines. Um, and what the Muslims did is they allowed religious freedom to every branch of Christianity in Al Aqsa. So as long as Muslims were controlling Al Aqsa, those who followed the Byzantine version of Christianity could go to Al Aqsa for pilgrimage. Those following the Roman Catholic version could go for pilgrimage, as well as every other version. Right? To us, they just Ahlul Kitab. They're all Christians. They're all given the same rights. So it was in the best interest of Christians at that time that Jerusalem was controlled by a non-Christian power that gave them freedom of religion. So Christians weren't fighting each other for the Holy Lands. And this is why there wasn't much scuffles or fighting over Jerusalem uh, from the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab anhu for the next 300 years. Nothing. Christians were quite happy with the status quo, that Muslims were in charge, there was religious freedom, any Christian could go and live in that land as long as they paid the jizya, any Christian could go for a religious pilgrimage to that land, and that suited everybody. So what happened in the 11th century that changed things? What happened in the 11th century was a period of civil war amongst the Muslims. So going back to what we spoke about the Abbasid Empire, we said that the Abbasids in the after the first 300 years they began to, or rather we say after the first 200 years, the Abbasids began to lose power, and each of their lands began to splinter off and become a mini kingdom with its own ruler. Some of these rulers had more power than the Abbasids, but they still referred to the Abbasid as the Caliph, as a figurehead, as a puppet Caliph. Right? This is the period where the Abbasid is just a figurehead. He doesn't have any real power. And other governors and sultans are fighting for control of various territories. At this point in time, two powers arise in the Muslim world, both of which want to control Jerusalem. The first, to the north, we have the Ismaili Shia movement known as the Fatimids or the Ubaidis. The Fatimids were a group of Ismaili Shias who took over Egypt. Right? Their founder claimed to be the Mahdi. He gathered a following around his claim, and he took over Egypt, and he began to oppress the Sunni majority and enforce Ismaili Shiism upon the people. And he set his sights on Jerusalem, that he wants Al-Aqsa to belong to his people. At the same time, to the north, we have the first ever Turkish Muslim Empire. Not the Ottomans, the Seljuks. Right, so for those of you all who watch the Ertugrul show, you'll notice that at that time, the ruling power in Turkey is the Seljuks. And it's only after the Seljuks that he passes to the Ottomans, when the last Seljuk king dies. So the Seljuks go back long before the Ottomans. They go back to this period. They were the first Turkish people to gain power. The Abbasids did not want to keep power only in the hands of the Arabs, not like the Umayyads. So they began to appoint governors from different races. And so from the Turks, they chose the Seljuks to be their governors, but the Seljuks grew very powerful and they became an independent sultanate, and they wanted control of Jerusalem. So different powers are now fighting over Jerusalem. And what happens during this fight, what happens during this war, is that the Seljuks end up taking over Jerusalem, but they are not as educated about Islam as the Abbasids were, and they don't give the Christians and the Jews of Jerusalem their full rights. Instead, they begin to destroy churches, they begin to oppress some of the Christians, they begin to take away some of their religious rights, and news of this travels to the Pope. News of this travels all the way to Europe, to the Pope, where they are told that in Jerusalem, in the Holy Land, Muslims are killing our people, Muslims are oppressing our people, Muslims are destroying our churches. Now, note, just like how we don't distinguish between the different branches of Christianity in terms of treating all of them equally, they don't know the difference between a Seljuk and a Abbasid and a Fatimid, nor do they care about the difference between Sunni and Shia. All they know is Muslims are harming their people. So, that status quo that lasted for 300 years, that it's fine that the Muslims control Jerusalem because we all get to travel there and do a pilgrimage in peace, that's gone now. Instead, they are looking at the Muslims as oppressors, right, because of one dynasty that did not follow Islam. So the Pope comes up with a political move to bring Jerusalem back under Christian rule. And that is an entirely new innovation he comes up with called the Crusades, a holy war. And that's why the most famous crusade was the one that took place for 150 to almost 200 years. The effort to liberate Jerusalem and the surrounding areas from Islamic rule and make that a Christian land called the Kingdom of Jerusalem or the Kingdom of Heaven. This was the most famous crusade. There were actually more than 5 crusades, but this is the most famous one, and this is what we are going to focus on. So again, the Crusades was a reaction to oppression done by the Seljuks and the Fatimids, and their reaction did not discriminate between any Muslims. In the meanwhile, the Seljuks did not hold Jerusalem for long. They lost it to the Fatimids, and again, the Christians don't care. Either way, for them, these are Muslims, and they're controlling our lands, and we need to take these lands back. So, in the year 1095, so this is like 930 years ago, 940 years ago, Pope Urban II came up with the idea of the Crusades. And he declared the First Crusade, encouraging military support for the Byzantium Emperor against the Seljuk Turks, and he called for armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Now let's break this down. We said that the Christians of Europe did not support the Byzantium Empire because there were different denominations of Christianity. But now they see it as necessary to work together to get rid of the Muslim threat in that land. Right? So they now see it necessary to unite against the Muslims. So he's willing to militarily support the Byzantiums even though they see them as heretical in their beliefs. Number 2, it was against the Seljuk Turks. Now we notice that by the time they get to Jerusalem, it is the Fatimids in control and not the Seljuks. Number 3, this is a very crafty bit of political maneuvering by the Pope. He didn't call it a holy war. He didn't call it a war at all. He called it an armed pilgrimage. That is, peasants and noblemen alike from Europe were encouraged to take up arms and make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem with permission to fight and kill and loot any Muslims they find along the way. Promised great rewards, promised that their sins will be forgiven by the church if they do this for the sake of God. So a religious pilgrimage which includes war. In reality, it was a war disguised as a religious pilgrimage. And so thousands of people across Europe gathered together and began to make armed pilgrimages towards Jerusalem, and along the way attacking caravans, attacking towns, attacking farms, attacking villages, and taking over various Muslim lands. Now it's important to note that the Muslims of that time did not see this coming. They were, number one, caught up in their own civil war. The Seljuks, the Fatimids, and the Abbasids were still fighting each other. Number 2, they always looked at the Byzantiums as their enemy. Their focus was always towards the Eastern Roman Empire. They ignored Europe because, to be fair, Europe was going through a dark age. Europe was a backwards land. They did not have technology. They did not have science. They did not have what the Muslims had. The Muslims did not see them as a threat. They did not see them as their equals, and they underestimated what religious zeal could do for these people. So they did not look at anyone coming from that side as an actual threat. They only used to 2 types of people traveling from Europe to the Muslim lands. Either pilgrims heading towards Jerusalem for a Christian pilgrimage, or traders coming to do business with the Muslims. So those lands weren't that well guarded, and those lands kind of let their guard down whenever they saw pilgrims coming, because until this point in history, Christian pilgrims were peaceful people. It never crossed the Muslim minds that these armed pilgrims marching towards Jerusalem are about to cause bloodshed and take over all these lands. That just wasn't something that they had any historical precedence for at that time. So this was just let go. It was just something that, they saw these guys walking, and they're, these pilgrims coming and going to Jerusalem for their pilgrimage as usual, having no idea of what went down in the church, having no idea about the Pope's declaration, having no idea about the concept of crusades, about what was promised to the Crusaders, nothing. They just saw pilgrims coming. Now, across Western Europe, the response to this was very enthusiastic. People were really, really poor in Europe at that time. And the Muslims at that time were the dominant superpower. They were the largest empire, the most powerful empire, the wealthiest empire. The Pope giving Christians permission to enter the Muslim lands, to loot their lands, to steal, to take over their lands, to take over their wealth. This was something that many people were perhaps waiting for, hoping for, wishing for. Now they had a religious reason to do it. They had religious permission to do it. They even had promise of religious rewards for doing it. And so, with a lot of zeal, people from across all backgrounds in Europe united for these armed pilgrimages. So let's take a look at some of the reasons historically as to why the Crusades happened, and these reasons are not necessarily Islamic. They are more an historical analysis done by both Muslim and non-Muslim historians to help us understand why this happened. So we looked at one political reason, right, and that is the what the Seljuks had done to Christians in their lands, right, and the Fatimids as well. Both of those empires did not have the same good reputation as the Abbasids or the Umayyads. But there were internal reasons for the Crusades as well. Reasons for their success, reasons why so many people joined them, reasons why they were so enthusiastic and zealous. Let's take a look at some of these reasons. Number one was religious salvation. They were promised paradise in exchange for this campaign. They were promised forgiveness for their sins in exchange for this campaign. Now, if for someone growing up in Europe at that time, to whom Christianity is the truth, right? For them, they viewed Christianity as the truth, and they viewed the Pope as speaking for God. To hear the Pope tell them that if you do this, your sins are forgiven and you go into paradise, this lit up in them a fire, a form of religious zeal that was terrifying. You can actually compare, if you want to look at a comparison from the Muslim world, you can compare the Crusaders to the Khawarij, right, in their religious zeal and their zeal for blood. That they viewed what they were doing as holy, they viewed what they were doing as good, they viewed what they were doing as a path to paradise. And when somebody becomes convinced of this, it is terrifying what they would do in the name of religion. May Allah protect us and always keep us balanced in our understanding of the truth. But just as the Khawarij are the typical Muslim example of what misplaced religious zeal can lead to, the Crusades are a mirror example in Christianity. That just as misplaced religious zeal caused Kharijites to commit bloodshed in the name of Islam, misplaced religious zeal caused Crusaders to cause bloodshed in the name of Christianity. So the promise of religious salvation played a major role in gathering the troops, giving them a lot of zeal and pushing them forward to do this with the utmost violence and savagery. Number two was satisfying feudal obligations. So the feudal system of Europe at that time, certain people were tied to other people. They had responsibilities to fulfill towards other people. They didn't want to call it slavery, although historically, if you look at it, it was a type of slavery. It's just they didn't call it that. But essentially, it was like a contract, right? Where some people owed certain people, and so just say there's a rich spoiled kid who doesn't want to go on the Crusades, and somebody else is, has a feudal obligation towards him. He would send that person out instead, and that person, wanting to be free, wanting that contract to be over, wanting that the obligation to be over, would do everything possible to make this mission successful and to ensure that he gets his freedom through this. Number three was the opportunities for renown, for becoming famous. And really, many of the Crusaders became famous. Right till today, you will find them in video games as characters, in movies and TV series as characters. You hear people talking about them. It was a time to become famous. And we know that the desire for fame causes people to do terrible things. And this is why in Islam, chasing after fame is a sin. It's something a Muslim should never do. A Muslim should never seek fame. Because when you seek fame, you will do anything to get it. And the Crusades are a good example of that. That was a time to become known for one's courage, to become known for one's skills, to become known for the lands you've taken over and the people you have killed and the lands you have looted. And so many people who had in their hearts this desire for fame, they went out and they joined the Crusades and they became the leaders of the Crusades. Number 4 was the economical advantages. So again, we said that the Muslims were the dominant power of that time, and the Christian lands were comparatively poor. This was a chance to gain a piece of the Muslim wealth. This was a chance to go into Muslim lands and basically loot those lands, take over these lands, or even if you don't take over those lands, take some of their stuff and go back to your lands with it. It was a get rich quick scheme that involved violence and bloodshed, right? And many people who were greedy for wealth or who were desperate, not necessarily greedy, maybe just desperate, peasants, farmers, people who had the lowest level of society, this was their one chance to get wealthy. And they took it and they ran with it. And by the way, the Crusades did have a very strong economic advantage on Europe because they did bring back a lot of the Muslim wealth to Europe. Not just wealth, but a lot of the ideas, a lot of the science, a lot of the education, a lot of the technology, a lot of the culture, and a lot of the food of the Muslim world was introduced to Europe by the Crusaders. So Crusaders went to Muslim lands. They conquered Muslim lands. But in the process, they came back with new knowledge, with new ideas, with new culture, with new practices. And a lot of the things that made the Muslims the superpower of their time and gave the Muslims an advantage over the Europeans, these things slowly now became part of European culture. And so the Crusades were terrible for Muslims, but they also were very beneficial to Europe, in that this was how Europe got hold of things that it otherwise may never have gotten hold of, as far as knowledge and resources and wealth is concerned. So there was the economic advantage, and then there was the political advantage. That Christians had not had any control over Jerusalem for over 400 years. For the Christians of Europe to conquer Jerusalem would put them on a political level higher than that of the Byzantians, and would establish for them a power base in the Middle East itself. And the Middle East back then, the Muslim world back then, was the most powerful land on earth. To have a political base over there, to have control of land over there, was something very, very advantageous in terms of both dealing with Muslims and dealing with the Byzantians. So lots of opportunity and political advantage, not just for the kingdom as a whole, but even for individuals. Many people who left Europe as peasants, or as people with feudal contracts, or as low-level princes who are never going to inherit the kingdom because the older brother was going to do so, whatever it was, many people who left Europe because they saw no future for themselves in Europe became governors and kings in the Crusader kingdoms. So there was a political advantage even on the individual level, and all of these things caused the Crusades to be very, very successful. They just swept into the Muslim lands, took over many Muslim lands, and established 3 kingdoms next to each other, the most famous and important of which was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. This is the biggest and the most important of the 3 kingdoms established in what was now at that point in time the Muslim lands. So what did they do? Number 1, they established states in the Middle East, namely 3 states that we discussed about. And the most important thing is that Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders. And this caused a splintering of the Ummah and devastation throughout the Ummah. Now imagine living in that time. Just take a moment to think about this. Imagine living in that time. Imagine up until that point in time, Muslims didn't really lose. From the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam until this point in time, the Ummah was just expanding. It was Medina, Mecca, then Arabia, then Asham and Iraq and Egypt and then North Africa and Spain and Samarkand and parts of India. It's just expanding, 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 and then suddenly Al-Aqsa, the third holiest land, falls to the Christians. A massacre takes place. Muslims are not allowed to enter that land anymore, not allowed to pray in that land anymore. And a huge chunk of the Middle East that was Muslim for over 300 years is now part of the Christian Empire. Can you imagine how demoralizing that was for the Muslims of that time? And so this was a huge, huge hit to the morals and the morale and the uh, uh, energy and the strength of the Ummah. And the Ummah was now split. We had the Fatimids in Egypt, we had the Abbasids in Baghdad, we had the Seljuks in Turkey, and we have the Crusaders in Al-Aqsa and the surrounding areas. So right there in the middle, that land that is so important, both religiously and politically, is not under Muslim control. And the Muslim lands surrounding it are not united. They are at war with each other. They don't like each other. They're not going to work together. So the splintering of the Ummah was a devastating thing that took place in that time. It wasn't just the fall of Jerusalem that was devastating, but more than that, the massacre of Jerusalem. So the Crusaders didn't just take over Jerusalem. Had that been the case, had they just taken over Jerusalem and allowed all religions to have similar freedom to what the Muslims had given, and asked the Muslims to pay some kind of jizya or something in exchange for living there and worshipping Al-Aqsa, maybe history would have been different. Maybe Muslims would have tolerated their presence. Maybe Muslims have just let it go. But instead, Muslims were banned from Al-Aqsa for 90 years, as were the Jews. Muslims and Jews were now both banned from the Holy Land, holy to both religions. As were other types of Christians whose beliefs did not match that of the Crusaders. And the Crusaders massacred thousands of people. Thousands of people were massacred during this war, not just Muslims. We often think of the Crusades as being just against Muslims, but really it was anyone who they saw as heretical. This included Jews, this included mostly Muslims, but it also included Christians who followed other denominations of Christianity. And so this was it wasn't just a war, it was a massacre. It was a complete wiping out of entire families and communities and tribes to establish a Christian kingdom in the Middle East. And you may notice the similarities between the story and what's happening in the world today. That the Muslims started fighting each other and we lost Jerusalem. And surrounding Jerusalem are a bunch of Muslim countries that don't get along and are divided along sectarian lines and political lines and are at war with each other. While Al-Aqsa is in the hands of a foreign power who is not giving Muslims their rights. History repeating itself almost exactly 1,000 years ago to today. The good thing is that the story 1,000 years ago has a good ending after 90 years. So we are optimistic that the same will happen maybe in our lifetime or in the lifetime of the next generation. That they will see that history repeating itself as well and the Muslims regaining control of their land. So what happened? The Crusaders come in. They take over Al-Aqsa. They massacre about 60,000 people in Al-Aqsa alone, in Jerusalem alone. Muslims, Christians and Jews alike. They boast about this in their own diaries. Right till today, the diaries of the Crusaders are available and translated. And in these diaries, they boast about the streets flowing with blood and the skulls piled mountains high. They were very fanatical and barbaric in their methodology, and they boasted about things like this. And this completely destabilized the region. It completely demotivated the Muslims. What happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rose up from amongst the Muslims a hero who would take the lands back. And this hero is Yusuf ibn Ayyub, more popularly known as Salahudin al-Ayoubi, rahimahullah. So the Muslims did not forget about Al-Aqsa. This is the third holiest land. This is a place where we are encouraged to travel towards to pray Salah. This is a land that was under Muslim rule for 300 years. This is a place when, for those living in that time, many of their friends and family and fellow Muslims were massacred. This was a very important location, religiously and politically. And Muslims never forgot. And they continued to fight and they continued to try and take back this land. The most famous person who tried to do this was a general, a governor by the name of Nuruddin al-Zingri. Nuruddin al-Zingri was a political leader in that region at that time, uh, who was very charismatic, very famous, and very shrewd as a politician. And his entire political campaign revolved around one simple concept: Muslims need to unite to take back Al Aqsa. It's fascinating. I mean, I think that campaign could work today. Muslims need to unite to take back Al Aqsa. Right? I mean, that's exactly what we need today. This is what he thought of 1,000 years ago. Muslims need to unite to take back Al Aqsa. And he began to unite various lands behind him, build armies, build strongholds, and fight back against the Crusaders and take back a few small towns from them. He was never able to actually reclaim Al Aqsa in his lifetime. But he did lay the groundwork for it in terms of coming up with this political campaign, building up a force, uniting many regions, and most importantly, he noticed in a young man, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the potential of leadership. And he mentored this young man and he raised this young man to be a military leader in the region. So, Salahudin al-Ayoubi, born as Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was a Kurdish Muslim soldier who Nuruddin noticed in him greatness. And sometimes leaders do this. Many a times leaders, when they're interacting with people, they just notice something special about specific individuals and they latch on to those individuals and they become mentors to them and put their hope in that person. And so Nuruddin developed this kind of bond with Salahuddin, where he essentially mentored him and helped him to basically become the next Nuruddin. So his name is Yusuf ibn Ayyub. He's popularly known as Salahuddin, the reviver of the religion, al-Ayoubi, from the descendants of Ayyub. And his descendants would become known as the Ayyubi dynasty. And Salahuddin was more influential and more popular than Nuruddin, to such an extent that a civil war almost occurred between them. So Nuruddin had sent Salahuddin Ayyubi to Egypt to try and convince the Fatimids to unite with Nuruddin's forces to fight the Crusaders. And Salahuddin grew so powerful in Egypt that the Fatimid Empire ended and he became the new governor, the new Sultan of Egypt. And he did this not through war and bloodshed, but through diplomacy, through getting to know the right people, building the right contacts, getting the right people on his side, becoming popular. He rose up in the ranks, became a close advisor to the Fatimid king, and eventually people wanted him as their ruler, and he was instated as the Sultan of Egypt by the Abbasid Empire. So Salahuddin grew more popular than Nuruddin. And this led to tension between them. It almost led to a war between them, but Nuruddin passed away. And this is perhaps from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to prevent a war between these two great people who we look up to. Now, at this point, I need to mention something very important. One of the problems we have as a ummah when we study history is that we tend to turn these political figures into myths and legends. Right? We tend to think of them as these perfect awliya with no faults. Whether we're talking about Salahuddin Ayyubi or Eturul Ghazi or Suleiman the Magnificent or Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, may Allah have mercy on all of them. We tend to exaggerate their good qualities and ignore any mistakes they made or pretend that they never made any mistakes. And we build up such a hype and a myth around them that their actual biographies can't live up to the hype. And this is our problem, that instead of studying history for what it is as history. We want to study history like some kind of mythology. And we want to build up the story of heroes and villains and legends and amazing people. In reality, these were normal human beings. They were pious in some aspects of their life, they were sinners in other aspects of their life. They were brilliant in some parts of this world, and they were, you know, not good at other aspects of worldly life. And particularly those of them who were given political power, I don't think any politician in history after the Khulafa Rashidin can live up to our expectations. Right? Muslims today have this such a supernatural, perfect mythological idea of a Khalifa that 99% of Khalifas throughout history will not live up to those expectations. Rather, the majority of the Khalifas in history were human beings. They had their faults, they had their sins, they had their good deeds, they had their bad deeds, and you can't really do politics without getting your hands dirty. You can't really do politics without, getting involved in things that are not nice. I mean, if you are going to be a politician in the medieval world or even in the modern world, there's going to be things where you're going to have to choose the lesser of two evils. And what you choose to do may still be evil, but you have to look at what has the overall benefit. So I mention this because I don't like this idea of us raising Salahudin to such a level that when his faults are brought up, we lose iman. Or we refuse to believe history because we can't imagine him doing anything wrong. He was, for all intents and purposes at that time, a regular governor who was maybe a bit more knowledgeable about the religion, a bit more pious than other governors, but he was still a governor, he was still a sultan. He still bribed people, he still killed people, he still sought political power, he still put his sons in power after him, he was still involved in nepotism, he was still involved in almost starting a civil war with his mentor. He had faults like everybody else. But on the other hand, as Muslims, when we look at our historical figures, we also look at them from a lens of they have passed on. Let's not dwell on the faults. May Allah have mercy on them. Right? So we have to find this balance. On one hand, we have people who only want to analyze the faults and look for faults and are obsessed with the faults to such an extent that they begin to demonize these historical figures and they begin to look at them as evil people. And on the other hand, we have people who exaggerate their praises and put them on such a high pedestal that the reality can never live up to the hype and the imagination we have built around them. Reality, these were men. They sinned and they did good deeds. But we remember them for their good deeds and we ask Allah to forgive their sins. That's why whenever we mention any of these historical figures, we say, Rahimahullah, may Allah have mercy on him. When we say, may Allah have mercy on him or may Allah have mercy on her, we are acknowledging this person had sins, this person has faults. May Allah's mercy override that. May Allah's mercy override their sins and their faults. May Allah accept their good deeds and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make them from the people of Jannah. This is our approach to those who have passed away. So when we study history, sometimes we may bring up things that are the faults of historical figures. It doesn't mean that we hate them. It doesn't mean that we want to focus on these faults. It doesn't mean we are obsessed with these faults. We are simply being unbiased about the history. But we will focus on their good qualities. We will make dua for them. And we will be optimistic that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive their sins and accept their good deeds because they passed away upon La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. And so we will approach them with this optimism. So it's important for us to have this attitude when dealing with our historical figures. So with that in mind, Salahudin Ayyubi, he was very shrewd. He was very charismatic. He was very popular. He took on the campaign of the Muslims need to unite behind one leader to take back Al-Aqsa after Nuruddin had passed away, and people began to unite behind him to take back Al-Aqsa because now the Fatimids are gone. Nuruddin is gone. He's now the most powerful man in the region. He's by far the most pious of all the leaders. He's by far the most charismatic of all the leaders. He's by far the best military genius of all the leaders. He has the best character of all the leaders. All of this put together caused people to flock to him. And his army grows and his power grows. And finally, the Muslims have a chance to take back the Holy Land, to take back Al-Aqsa. So do we have enough time to cover the retaking of Al-Aqsa? Okay, I think we will do one more slide and then we'll close off for today and do the rest next week. The retaking of Al-Aqsa. So Salahudin Ayyubi, he took over Egypt and ruled it from 1163 to 1193. So he ruled Egypt for 30 years. And in 1187, he took over Jerusalem. So about 24 years into his reign as Sultan, he takes over Jerusalem. Now let's break down these events and take a look at it. So Egypt, we understand what Egypt was at that time. Egypt had been ruled by the Ismailis for around 90 years, very similar to how long the Crusaders had been ruling Jerusalem. So both of these lands had fallen for about 90 years each to different enemies. Egypt to the Fatimids and Jerusalem to the Crusaders. The Fatimids had done a lot of damage in Egypt. They had oppressed the Sunni majority. For example, they had banned Tarawih. They had created a whole lot of holidays, right, to try and get the masses to love them. The most famous of these holidays, the one that stuck around right until today, is the Mawlid, the celebration of a prophet's birthday. Now, this is a historical class, so I'm not passing any judgment on the Mawlid. I'm simply saying, historically, that's its roots. Historically, it started off by the Ismailis as a political move to get people to like them. When Salahuddin takes over, he keeps the Mawlid as a holiday, and it enters into Sunni Islam through that, right, through that political move by Salahuddin. Another thing the Ismailis did was they built Al-Azhar University. And Salahuddin keeps Al-Azhar University, but he converts it into a Sunni university, and it remains so right until today. So that same Al-Azhar University in Egypt today has been a Sunni university since the time of Salahudin Ayyubi. That is 900 years. For 900 years there has been a Sunni university. So it's very old, very prestigious. So he takes over Egypt. He's now the Sultan of Egypt under the Abbasid Caliph. Remember, it's very important to remember this point of history. At that point in time, the Abbasids had no power. The Abbasids are just figureheads. Salahuddin's the man in power. Salahuddin's the one who people know by name, who people see, who people love, who people trust, who people follow, who people will go to war for. The Abbasid, he's just a figurehead. Salahuddin's the Sultan of this region, and in his khutbahs, he says we pledge allegiance to the Khalifa of the Abbasid Empire. So, really, the Khalifa is just there to say that, look, the Khalifa is still an Abbasid, he's still from the family of the Prophet ﷺ, or descendant of the Prophet's uncle, he's still from the Quraysh, and this guy is just a Sultan working for the Khalifa. In reality, the Quraysh had no power at that time. All of the power is with this general Salahuddin. So it's important to understand, because when you look at this point in history, a lot of people wonder, where's the Khalifa? Right? Why are we studying Salahuddin and Nuruddin and the Seljuks and the Fatimids? Where's the Khalifa? The Khalifa is powerless. This is the point in history where for the next few hundred years, the Khalifa is just a figurehead, is just a puppet ruler. He has no real power. It's just there to feign some kind of unity in the Ummah and some kind of link to the Quraysh. So Salahuddin is the real man of power. His power grows, and the Crusaders become threatened by his power, and a battle takes place between the Crusader armies and Salahuddin that devastates the Crusaders. Before that, 100 years before this, we said that the Muslims of that region were fighting each other, and this weakened them and allowed the Crusaders to come in and take over Jerusalem. Fast forward 90 years, the same thing now happens amongst the Crusaders. That the king of the kingdom of Jerusalem at that point in time was a 16-year-old with leprosy, and he was dying from leprosy, and he had no descendants. So his sister, his ministers, his generals, they all start fighting for power, and they all want to be the next king. They know this man has no power. he's sickly, he's dying, he's weak, he has no descendants. They all begin to fight for control of Jerusalem and for leading the crusades. And they end up weakening their own empire with these fights. And then the biggest blow of all was the Battle of Hattin. So in the Battle of Hattin, Salahudin took his army out into a huge field, and the Crusaders, thinking that this was the opportunity to wipe away Salahudin and his army, they sent their entire force after Salahudin. And it is a complete one-sided victory. Salahudin's army completely destroys the Crusader army, and there is nobody left to defend Jerusalem besides a few average people, right? So the entire Crusader army is defeated by the army of Salahudin in Hattin. What's left at Jerusalem? One nobleman by the name of Balian, who has a good relationship with Salahudin. To put things in context, Balian wanted to give up the Crusades and to go back to his land with his wife and his child. And Salahudin had promised safe access for his family back to his lands. But the king had banned Balian from leaving that land and put him in charge of the defense of Jerusalem. So he was obligated to stay in Jerusalem and fight Salahudin. But Salahudin, being the great man that he was, he still gave Balian's family safe passage and escort to their lands to make sure they got back to their land safely, so they were not caught up in the war for Jerusalem and they were not killed by mistake in the war for Jerusalem. So Balian is now left alone in Jerusalem to defend this land, surrounded by peasants, by farmers, by traders, by whoever's left behind in the few guards of the city, and Salahudin's entire army is coming. A siege takes place, and Salahudin surrounds Jerusalem for about 2 weeks, from the 20th of September until the 2nd of October. Finally, during the siege, there's back and forth, catapults, arrows. Again, remember, cities in those days are designed with a wall around the city and a few entrances, and there are arches on the walls, and you have to get through one of the entrances to get into the city. So it's all a battle for the walls, and that's why the siege can last for months. But it's clear that the Christians are not going to win. No reinforcements are coming from the Christian lands. The local Crusader army has been devastated, wiped out. Whoever's left, most of them have ran away back to their lands, back to their mini kingdoms, to try and protect their kingdoms from Salahudin, because they're more worried about losing their own kingdom to Salahudin than trying to protect Jerusalem. It's just Balian and his forces left in Jerusalem. So finally he decides to meet with Salahudin outside the walls of the city and discuss handing it back over to the Muslims. Now, why was this delayed by 2 months? Very simple reason. They were afraid, and rightfully so, that if the Muslims take over Jerusalem, they are going to take revenge for what happened 90 years before that. What happened 90 years before that? The Christians entered Jerusalem and killed everybody, man, woman, or child, regardless of their religion. Their descendants are now living in Jerusalem, defending it against the Muslim army, and they are terrified that the Muslim army is going to come in and take revenge, that the Muslim army is going to come in and kill every man, woman, and child. But that's not the way of Islam. And Salahuddin, alhamdulillah, it was the qadr of Allah that someone who took Islam seriously was leading this army. Salahuddin wanted to emulate the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in retaking Al-Aqsa. He wanted to do at Al-Aqsa what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did in Makkah. That the people of Makkah had treated Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the believers so badly. But when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam took over Makkah, he forgave the people, he entered in peace, and he allowed them to live in peace. And we see that the same thing is what Salahuddin does here. So Salahuddin takes over Al-Aqsa in a surprisingly peaceful negotiation. Even though the war for Jerusalem was very long and bloody, many battles over 90 years. But the actual conquest was a discussion between Balian and Salahuddin. And a discussion that ended very peacefully, because Salahuddin was not interested in killing anyone. He was not interested in taking revenge. He was simply interested in restoring the status quo of Al-Aqsa. That this is the Holy Land. As long as Christians and Jews are coming as peaceful pilgrims or living here peacefully paying the jizya, they have full religious freedom. And so that's what he offered. He offered peace, freedom of religion within the boundaries of Islam, of course, not the modern understanding, and safety to all Christians. He offered those who want to return to their lands can go back to their lands. Those who want to stay here can stay here. Those who want to stay here need to pay the jizya. Those who want to go back to their lands will be escorted peacefully. He did not massacre anybody. And this move of his makes him famous and legendary even in non Muslim circles. Even the non Muslims praise him for this, they look up to him for this. They consider him one of the most generous and tolerant leaders in the history of this world, because remember, he's living during a time where it would have been completely normal to take over a city and massacre people. That's what all the Christians were doing. That's what the Romans were doing. That's what the Crusaders were doing. So the Muslim approach was shocking. That we did this to your people 90 years ago and you are giving us peace, forgiveness, freedom of religion. I mean, freedom of religion itself was an unknown concept at that time. So Salahuddin became legendary for what happened at that event. And I mean, even the Christians themselves have a movie of this, The Kingdom of Heaven, which shows the journey of Balian from the farms to the Crusaders to ruling Jerusalem to finally the negotiation with Salahuddin. It's all covered in a movie. And they do a decent job of portraying Salahuddin in the movie. I mean, not 100% accurate, but a decent job considering it's a Christian movie. And it's really amazing how Salahuddin took back Al-Aqsa. And one of the benefits we can take from this story is that just as the first half of this history seems to be repeating itself with Al-Aqsa today, where a foreign power has come in that nobody was ever thought would be powerful, a group of people that nobody was looking at as the enemy, and they've taken over Al-Aqsa and they are oppressing the Muslims and they're denying us our rights, and the Muslim lands around it are fighting each other and disunited, and some of them even siding with the enemy. The same story is happening. So we hope that the second half of the story will happen as well, which is that Allah will gift this ummah a new leader who will unite the ummah in taking back the holy lands and restoring the peace, justice, and freedom of religion that Islam is known for in that region. So with that, we come to the end of today's lecture, and I hope you found this beneficial. We will continue looking at the history of this region and this era next week by taking a look at the Fatimids and the later Crusades and their impact on the region. Subhana rabbi izzat masifun wa salam al mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.